Now, I want to start off this month with a murder mystery that to this day is unsolved, which is the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. This case is very well known and has been adapted into many movies and TV shows. A lot of people have done paranormal investigations into this case to see if they can figure out what truly happened, and the majority of people believe that it was Lizzie Borden who committed these murders. And there's actually been a lot of skepticism and speculation within this case that should seem very cut and dry, but it isn't. Lizzie Andrew Borden was born on July 19th, 1860 in Fall River, Massachusetts, where she lived with her parents Andrew and Sarah Borden and had a sister named Emma. The family was living in a home in Fall River that Andrew had renovated to become more suitable for what their family desired. Her father worked in manufacturing and real estate, so the family was doing quite well in terms of money. And unfortunately, shortly after Lizzie's birth, her mother passed away, and her father remarried 3 years later to a woman named Abby DeFree Gray. However, not everything was smooth sailing within this family. For instance, Andrew Borden was said to be quite the penny pincher even though the family had a lot of money. And the sisters ended up becoming quite resentful of this, as the Borden house did not have electricity or indoor plumbing, even though those were luxuries that wealthy people during that time could afford to have in their house. And I can definitely see why, as a wealthy family, the girls wanted to live within the means that their father had obtained and not below them as they were doing. But since Andrew made his money of his own accord, he worked very hard, he did everything himself in order to gain his wealth, it makes me wonder if perhaps Andrew was scared that one day he would lose his money. So he was trying to spend as little money as possible so that if something bad did happen and they lost their wealth, then they would still have money saved up as sort of a backup plan, or maybe he just didn't want to flaunt his wealth within the community. The sisters, even though they were so young, were not very fond of their new stepmother and would often refer to her not by name, but as Mrs. Borden. And they were suspicious of their stepmother being a gold digger and hardly ever even ate dinner with their father and their stepmother, as apparently the girls even had their own issues with their father as well. Like I mentioned previously, with him living the frugal lifestyle that he did, therefore making the family live that way as well. But also, the sisters were apparently not pleased with how Andrew was dividing up the properties that he owned. As it's been said that Andrew had started gifting members of Abby's family with properties, and the sisters wanted their share, so they ended up purchasing the house that they'd lived in prior from their father for just $1, later selling it back to their father for $5,000, which would be around the area of $140,000 nowadays. In July of 1892, when Lizzie Borden was 32 years old, the sisters took what was deemed as being an extended vacation to New Bedford after having a family argument. But even after returning on the last week of July, Lizzie chose instead to stay at a rooming house instead of going back to her father's house. She stayed there for 4 days and then returned home. After her return, the whole family became ill with perhaps some sort of bug. Others thought that it was due to some meat that had been left out for a number of days and had gone bad, and then the family had eaten it and gotten sick. But Abby apparently was worried that the family had been poisoned, as supposedly Andrew's wealth and business dealings in real estate made him unpopular in some of the local circles. Lizzie, however, did find some happiness within her church, as she had a very religious upbringing and attended the Central Congregational Church, where she taught Sunday school to children who had recently immigrated into the country. In August of 1892, Andrew's brother John Morse came to visit the family, and the two of them actually had a business together that was unfortunately not doing so well. But while Andrew was still doing fine financially, John was not. On August 4th, 1892, John had left early that morning and Andrew had gone to work around 9 a.m., while Abby was upstairs tidying up the guest room that John had been sleeping in the night before. Andrew returned home a little while later and found that his key wasn't working in the door. He couldn't unlock it, so he knocked, and the family's live-in maid named Bridget Sullivan, who went by Maggie, went to answer the door, and then she went upstairs to the 3rd floor to her bedroom, where she had a lie down for a little bit after her morning of cleaning. Just a little while later, at 11:10 a.m., Lizzie yelled upstairs to Maggie, frantically telling her that her father had been murdered. When she got downstairs, she was met with a horrifying scene. Andrew had been found slumped over on the couch in the downstairs living room where he had been struck 10 times in the head with a hatchet. After an examination of his body later on, it had been suggested that he had been asleep when he was first attacked, so he didn't even realize what was about to happen to him. And investigators determined that he'd been killed only around 10 minutes prior to Lizzie calling up the stairs to the maid. And then Abby's body was found in the guest room. Forensic examination found that Abby had been facing her attacker and was hit on the side of the head with a hatchet, causing her to fall to the floor, where her attacker hit her 18 times with a hatchet to the back of the head. So suspicion immediately fell upon Lizzie, who had found her father's body first. Her sister Emma had been out of town when this happened, so it couldn't have been her. When questioned by police, Lizzie told the story of how she had heard noises, such as a groan or a scraping sound before she had entered her house that morning as she'd been out in the barn. Yet, 2 hours later, when she was asked the question again, she said that she'd heard nothing at all and had just entered the house as normal. So there were a number of contradictions to her stories. Police thought it was likely that the attacks had occurred from somebody within the house, but there was no evidence to support this, especially when you take into account that there was no blood found anywhere else in the house. No bloody footprints or anything leading away from the crime scenes. The blood was all centralized to the areas that Abby and Andrew had been murdered in, and Lizzie and Maggie were found with no blood on them either. Police thought that Lizzie's demeanor was not at all what it should be when her family had just been brutally murdered. Lizzie had been described as being too calm and too poised, while others described her as just being rude. But even with her contradictions and odd behavior, Lizzie was never checked for blood stains. Her bedroom was searched at first, but apparently they didn't look too hard, as apparently Lizzie wasn't feeling too well, so they neglected to do as thorough of a search as they should have, which was a criticism that the police faced later on. When the basement was searched, found were 2 hatchets, 2 axes, and a hatchet blade with a broken handle, which police thought could potentially be the murder weapon, as the break in the handle seemed new. But oddly enough, none of these tools were taken from the house as evidence. A few days later, it had been discovered that Lizzie had tried to purchase a poison called prussic acid on August 3rd. On August 6th, a more thorough search of the house was conducted, where they looked at the clothing and removed the weapons from the house. That was when Lizzie was accused of having burned a dress in the stove, which some believe had remnants of blood on it, which would have shown her immediate guilt of having murdered her father and stepmother. But Lizzie said that it was simply paint that was on this dress. It seemed as though police were having a hard time solidly pinning Lizzie as being the culprit of these murders. But who else could it have been? Because Lizzie was constantly giving alternative stories, and a theory that police had as to her involvement with the killings, which was that she may have potentially seen her father's will and discovered that she and Emma would be inheriting a lot of her father's estate, meaning that the girls would finally have the reign to live within the means that a wealthy person would be able to, and that in killing her father and stepmother would be a way to quicken that outcome. John Morse, meanwhile, had been seen leaving the house early that morning, but no one actually knew where he was for those 3 hours, because while he said he went to visit a doctor, that same doctor was at the Borden house examining the crime scene. So no one's sure if John made up the doctor excuse to cover up him doing something that he wouldn't want the police or potentially his community to know about, or if he was trying to hide the fact that it was he who committed the murders. So after the police's search, 2 days after the murders, which honestly would have given Lizzie so much time to cover things up if she was responsible for the murders, she was then officially listed as a suspect in the murders. Now, what about the maid, Maggie? Well, she was suspected too, especially after she had allegedly been seen carrying an unknown parcel out of the house that evening, but I don't think anything has really come from that. So Lizzie was then arrested in connection with the murders and appeared at an inquest on August 8th. Lizzie had been given morphine that she'd been prescribed to keep her calm, but it's been suggested that her testimony could have been affected by the drug, as she was acting quite strange and just erratic. As well, she wasn't allowed to have her lawyer present, as she was required to appear at this inquest by herself. Lizzie was apparently having trouble answering questions, or just wouldn't answer questions at all, and would provide more contradictory statements about what had happened that morning. She even mentioned at one point that she'd been scared that someone may have been threatening her father, thinking that whoever these people were would want to harm her family. She was also saying things like that she'd been in the kitchen reading the newspaper when her father came home. Then the next time around, she said she was in the dining room. And then another answer to the same question, she said she'd taken off her father's boots and put slippers on his feet as he laid down on the couch, even though the crime scene photos show him wearing boots. So things were not looking good for Lizzie here, but it has to be wondered if, due to her being under the influence of morphine at that time, was she really fit to be questioned, and could her testimony actually be deemed as being truthful? But she was still kept in a jail cell for the next 9 months until her trial, and during that time her story just blew up nationally, with feminist groups rallying to her side while others wholeheartedly believed that she was the one responsible for this. Lizzie's trial began on June 5th, 1893, and a big topic of discussion was that of the hatchet blade found in the basement. The prosecution argued that the handle had been removed due to it having been covered in blood. The accusation of Lizzie burning her dress was brought up, and the timeline of events of that morning was thoroughly dissected, trying to come to an idea of what had actually happened with Lizzie's contradictory statements that she'd given. What's interesting is that the heads of Andrew and Abby had actually been removed during the autopsy and were then brought to the trial as evidence, and apparently Lizzie fainted when she laid eyes upon them in the courtroom, and the defense even brought a number of witnesses forth who confirmed that they'd actually seen Lizzie leaving the barn while the murders had been being committed. And there were those who had apparently seen unknown people walking about the property that morning as well. And all of this was working to create a pocket of doubt in Lizzie's guilt. On the accusation of having purchased poison, the defense had the pharmacy employee's testimony dismissed from the evidence as having been irrelevant and prejudicial. On the 20th, the jury deliberated for an hour and a half, and when they returned to the courtroom with a verdict, Lizzie Borden was found to be not guilty and was free to leave the courtroom and continue on with her life as not being found guilty of having killed her parents. But from then on, Lizzie was always treated as having been guilty by the members of her community and was never truly accepted by them, which was exacerbated when she was accused of shoplifting in 1897. People refused to sit next to Lizzie at church, her friends stopped talking to her, and kids even started egging her house. Some people speculated that Lizzie could have performed the murders while under some sort of delusional state, where she then developed amnesia, and that's why a lot of the versions of events of her stories that she'd been given weren't making a lot of sense. As well, there had been speculation that Lizzie's father had been physically and sexually abusing her, which then caused her to reach her breaking point and violently murder him, doing so to her stepmother as well for perhaps keeping quiet about it. And then there were allegations brought forth by an author named Ed McBain, who had written a book about Lizzie Borden, saying that she may have been caught messing around with her maid by her stepmother, prompting Lizzie to kill Abby and then her father in a fit of rage. But there isn't much evidence to support this, as apparently Maggie found work somewhere else and ended up marrying a man in Montana. Though there are reports that while on her deathbed in 1948, Maggie had told her sister that she had been protecting Lizzie, and she had not been telling the truth about what she had seen when giving her testimony at Lizzie's trial. Using the money from their father's estate, the sisters were able to purchase a new home in one of the nicest neighborhoods that Lizzie ended up calling the house Maplecroft, where the two lived together for the next 10 years, and Lizzie ended up changing her name to Lisbeth A. Borden. Emma moved out of their shared house in 1905, and the sisters apparently never spoke again. Some think that it was because Lizzie had become close with a woman named Nance O'Neill, where the two may have been having a relationship that Emma did not approve of, but others speculate it's because she may have discovered the truth about what had actually happened to her father and stepmother. On June 1st, 1927, Lizzie Borden died of pneumonia at the age of 67, with her sister dying only a few days later of a kidney disease where she lived in New Hampshire. And interestingly enough, no one was invited to come to Lizzie's burial. Lizzie's legacy has lived on. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, her story has been adapted into many different movies. There have been a variety of books written about her, and there's even a skipping rope song that is based upon her case that goes, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41, which is so disturbing to think about children happily skipping rope to something like that. The Borden house today stands as a bed and breakfast breakfast as well as a museum, with objects from Lizzie's trial such as the blade are on display at the Fall River Historical Society. People who have visited the house claim that it is haunted by the ghosts of Andrew and Abby Borden. It's a really nice looking house on the outside. I'd love to visit it and see what kind of vibe I could sense out in there. But it's really crazy because to this day, we do not 100% know if it truly was Lizzie Borden who had murdered her father and stepmother. And this notoriously popular case will simply continue to remain unsolved for years to come.